9:30 on a rain-soaked Tuesday night. The century-old brick building on Millbrook's Main Street sat silent, its windows dark against the Connecticut storm. James Miller's calloused fingers wrapped around his battered toolbox as he descended the creaking wooden stairs to the basement. His wife's old flashlight, its silver surface worn smooth by countless late-night repairs, swept across the musty corridor. Then he froze. A soft, desperate whimper drifted from the shadows near the boiler room. The beam found her huddled against the cold stone wall. Even disheveled, she was breathtaking. Golden hair spilled like silk across her torn designer blazer. Her porcelain skin seemed to glow in the flashlight's amber circle. Those striking emerald eyes, wide with terror and relief, locked onto his face as if he were her guardian angel, materializing from the darkness. "Please," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "I've been trapped down here for hours." James didn't hesitate. He peeled off his worn denim jacket and wrapped it around her trembling frame. But this humble small-town electrician had no idea that rescuing this mysterious, elegant stranger would shatter everything he thought he understood about destiny, heartbreak, and finding love when you least expect it. James Miller had been fixing broken things for 38 years. Faulty wiring, busted pipes, shattered dreams. He'd learned to handle them all with the same steady hands and quiet patience. But nothing had prepared him for the sight of this woman emerging from the basement darkness like some lost princess from a fairy tale. She moved with an odd grace despite her obvious distress, her expensive heels clicking uncertainly on the concrete floor as he guided her toward the exit. The storm outside had intensified, sheets of rain hammering against the building's ancient windows. He couldn't just leave her stranded here, not in this weather, not in her condition. The only hotel in Millbrook had closed at 9, and she clearly had nowhere to go. His pickup truck's heater wheezed to life as they sat in the parking lot, the silence between them filled only by the rhythmic drumming of rain on the metal roof. She clutched his jacket tighter around her shoulders, and he noticed her hands, soft, manicured, bearing no trace of the calluses that marked his own. These weren't the hands of someone who'd ever struggled to make ends meet. Yet there was something broken in her posture, something that spoke of a different kind of hardship. When she finally looked at him, her green eyes held depths of pain he recognized all too well. It was the same look he'd seen in his own mirror every morning for the past 2 years, ever since Sarah's funeral. "I'm Anna," she said softly, offering nothing more. No last name, no explanation of how she'd ended up trapped in that basement, no mention of family or friends who might be worried. James nodded, understanding the weight of secrets. He'd carried his own for long enough. The drive to his small house on Elm Street took only 10 minutes, but it felt like crossing into another world. Anna stared out to the rain-streaked window at the modest homes with their glowing porch lights and well-tended gardens. This wasn't her world. That much was obvious from the way she held herself, the careful distance she maintained from everything around her. Tommy was asleep on the living room couch when they arrived, his 8-year-old frame curled around a worn teddy bear that had once belonged to his mother. A framed photograph sat on the coffee table beside him, James, Sarah, and baby Tommy at the beach, all smiles and sandy feet. Anna's breath caught when she saw the picture, her fingers instinctively moving to her throat, where a thin gold chain disappeared beneath her torn blouse. James quickly scooped his son into his arms, whispering reassurances as the boy stirred, but didn't wake. The guest room hadn't been used since Sarah's sister visited for the funeral. He set fresh towels on the bed and mumbled something about breakfast in the morning, before retreating to give Anna space to process whatever trauma had brought her into his life. Sleep eluded James that night. He lay in his empty bed, listening to the storm rage outside, and wondering what Sarah would think of the stranger now sleeping in their guest room. Sarah had always been the one with perfect instincts about people, able to read hearts and intentions with an accuracy that sometimes frightened him. She would have known immediately whether Anna could be trusted, whether her presence in their lives was blessing or burden. But Sarah was gone, and James was left to navigate these murky waters alone. The photograph on his nightstand showed Sarah's radiant smile, frozen forever at 29. "What would you do, sweetheart?" he whispered to the darkness. The only answer was the wind rattling the windows, and his own doubts echoing in the silence. Morning brought unexpected sounds from the kitchen, the gentle clatter of dishes, the whistle of the kettle, the soft humming of a melody he didn't recognize. James found Anna standing at his stove, her golden hair now clean and pulled back in a simple ponytail. She'd somehow transformed his rumpled clothes into something that looked almost elegant on her slender frame. Tommy sat at the kitchen table, his eyes wide with wonder as she flipped pancakes with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this countless times before. The sight struck James as both natural and completely surreal. This mysterious woman who'd materialized from a basement, now making breakfast in his dead wife's kitchen. "I hope you don't mind," Anna said without turning around. "I found some ingredients and thought I'd contribute something after your kindness last night." Her voice carried a slight tremor, as if she wasn't entirely sure of her welcome. Tommy, however, had no such reservations. He chatted away about his upcoming science project, his missing front tooth, and his father's job fixing broken electricity. Anna listened with genuine interest, asking questions that made the boy beam with pride. James watched this interaction with a mixture of gratitude and unease. Tommy hadn't shown this much enthusiasm for anything since Sarah's death, but allowing his son to become attached to someone so clearly temporary felt dangerous. The pancakes were perfect, light, fluffy, with just the right amount of vanilla. James had expected them to taste like cardboard in his mouth, as most food had since Sarah's passing, but instead he found himself savoring each bite. Anna ate sparingly, her movements precise and economical. She complimented Tommy's table manners and listened intently as he described his teacher, his best friend Marcus, and the upcoming school carnival. When Tommy asked if she had children of her own, something flickered across Anna's face. A shadow of loss so profound it made James's chest tighten. "No," she said simply, reaching over to ruffle Tommy's hair. "But I think little boys like you are pretty special." Over the following days, Anna became a fixture in their routine. She never explained where she'd come from or where she was supposed to be going. When James offered to drive her anywhere, home, work, family, she deflected with gentle but firm refusals. Instead, she threw herself into their daily life with an intensity that suggested she was running from something. She walked Tommy to school each morning, helped with homework each afternoon, and somehow convinced his perpetually messy son to actually enjoy cleaning his room. In the evenings, she would sit on the front porch with a cup of tea, watching the neighborhood settle into darkness with the attentiveness of someone memorizing every detail. James began to notice things that didn't quite add up. The way Anna held a knife when she cooked. Not like a casual home chef, but with the precision of someone who'd received professional training. Her extensive knowledge of art history when she helped Tommy with a school project about famous painters. The expensive watch she thought she'd hidden beneath her sleeve, its face catching the light when she gestured. Most telling of all was the way she spoke, educated, refined, with the subtle confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to. These weren't the traits of someone who worked a normal 9-to-5 job, yet she never mentioned her career or seemed concerned about missing work. Tommy adored her. He'd taken to calling her Miss Anna, with the formal politeness Sarah had drilled into him, but his eyes lit up whenever she entered a room. She helped him build elaborate Lego structures, taught him card games that seemed far too sophisticated for his age, and listened to his rambling stories with the patience of a saint. When he scraped his knee riding his bike, it was Anna who cleaned the wound and applied the bandage while James fumbled with the first aid kit. The natural way she comforted his son both warmed James's heart and terrified him. Tommy was already forming an attachment that would be devastating to break. One evening, as James worked late in his garage workshop, Anna appeared in the doorway like a ghost. She watched him rewire an old lamp with the same intensity she brought to everything else, her arms wrapped around herself against the cool autumn air. "You're very good at that," she observed, stepping closer to examine his work. When he offered to teach her the basics, she surprised him by accepting. Her hands, soft and unused to manual labor, fumbled with the wire strippers at first. But she learned quickly, asking intelligent questions and displaying a mechanical aptitude that seemed at odds with her delicate appearance. They worked in comfortable silence, the radio playing softly in the background, and James felt something shift between them, a connection that went deeper than circumstance. "Why are you here, Anna?" he asked finally, not looking up from his work. The question hung in the air between them like smoke. She was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because for the first time in years, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The honesty in her words hit him like a physical blow. He understood that feeling, the sense of rightness that had nothing to do with logic or planning. It was how he'd felt the first time he'd held Sarah's hand, how he'd felt when Tommy was born, how he'd felt watching Anna make pancakes in his kitchen just days ago. But contentment, James had learned, was a fragile thing. 3 weeks after Anna's arrival, as he and Tommy walked through the checkout line at Miller's Market, the comfortable bubble of their new normal burst with devastating efficiency. There, staring back at him from the magazine rack, was Anna's face. But the headline beneath her photograph told a different story entirely. "Elizabeth Wynne, Wall Street's golden girl vanishes amid corruption scandal." The elegant woman in the business suit looked every inch the powerful CEO, her emerald eyes cool and calculating in a way that made James's stomach drop. Tommy, oblivious to his father's shock, tugged at his sleeve asking for candy. James bought the magazine with hands that shook slightly, tucking it into their grocery bag like contraband. The article painted a picture of a financial empire built on deception. Elizabeth Wynne, 32 years old, had been the youngest CEO in her investment firm's history. She'd managed billions in client assets, hobnobbed with politicians and celebrities, lived in a Manhattan penthouse that cost more than James would make in a lifetime. Then came the allegations: market manipulation, insider trading, fraud on a scale that boggled the mind. Her business partner and closest confidant, Marcus Webb, had testified before Congress about her ruthless tactics and complete disregard for federal regulations. The FBI had raided her office, frozen her accounts, issued warrants for her arrest. And somewhere in the chaos of that night, Elizabeth Wynne had simply vanished. James sat in his truck outside their house for 20 minutes, staring at Anna through the kitchen window as she helped Tommy with his math homework. She looked so normal, so perfectly suited to their quiet life, that it seemed impossible she could be the same person described in the magazine. But the photographs didn't lie. The bone structure, the eyes, the elegant way she held herself, it was definitely her. Anna, his Anna, was Elizabeth Wynne. The mysterious woman he'd rescued from a basement was a fugitive from federal justice, and he'd been harboring her for 3 weeks without even knowing it. Worse still, he'd allowed his son to grow attached to someone whose very presence put their family at risk. That evening, after Tommy had been tucked into bed with his usual bedtime story, James confronted the woman he'd known as Anna. She was sitting on the front porch as she did every night, but tonight her stillness had a different quality, the tense alertness of prey sensing a predator. He set the magazine on the wicker table between them without a word. Her reaction confirmed everything. No surprise, no denial, just a slow nod and a weary sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world. "How long have you known?" Elizabeth asked, her voice stripped of the careful warmth she'd used with Tommy. The transformation was jarring. Suddenly she was every inch the powerful executive, calculating and controlled. "I bought it this afternoon," James replied, settling into the chair across from her. "The question is, how long were you planning to keep lying to us?" The accusation hung between them like a weapon. Elizabeth, he couldn't think of her as Anna anymore, closed her eyes as if gathering strength for a battle she'd been dreading. When she looked at him again, her emerald gaze held depths of pain and exhaustion that no amount of money or power could heal. "I never planned any of this," she said quietly. "I was supposed to disappear that night, to start over somewhere no one would find me. But then you—" She gestured helplessly at the house behind them, at the life they'd built together. "You made me remember what it felt like to be human again." The story she told over the next hour painted a picture far more complex than the magazine's sensational headlines. Elizabeth had been set up by Marcus Webb, the man she'd trusted most. He'd used her access codes to execute the illegal trades, forged her signature on incriminating documents, and manipulated evidence to make her look guilty. By the time she realized what was happening, the web of deceit was so complete that proving her innocence seemed impossible. The night James found her, she'd been hiding in the basement of her own office building, gathering evidence that might clear her name. But Marcus's security team had discovered her, and she'd barely escaped through an old service tunnel that connected to the building where James was working. "I never meant to involve you and Tommy," she continued, her hands twisted in her lap. "I was just going to disappear after that first night, but then I saw him sleeping on the couch, holding that picture of your family, and something inside me broke. I haven't been around children in years. I'd forgotten how pure they are, how they see straight through to your heart." Tears gathered in her eyes, threatening to spill over. "I know I should have told you the truth from the beginning. I know I had no right to disrupt your lives like this. But for 3 weeks, I got to pretend I was someone else. Someone who deserved the kind of happiness you and Tommy gave me." James wanted to be angry. He should have been furious at the deception, the danger she'd brought to his door, the way she'd manipulated his son's affections. But looking at her now, shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs, all her careful composure finally cracking, he felt something closer to pity. Elizabeth Wynne might have been a powerful CEO, but Anna, the woman who'd made pancakes in his kitchen and bandaged his son's scrapes, was just as real. The question was which version of her was telling the truth now. "So what happens next?" he asked, his voice gentler than he'd intended. "Do you run again? Find another basement to hide in? Another unsuspecting family to lie to?" The words hit their mark. Elizabeth flinched as if he'd slapped her, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "That's not fair," she whispered. "What I felt here, what I feel for you and Tommy, that was never a lie." But James had heard enough. The foundation of trust they'd built over 3 weeks had crumbled in the space of an hour, leaving nothing but wreckage and regret. He stood abruptly, the magazine falling from his lap to scatter pages across the porch. "I need you to leave," he said, not trusting himself to look at her. "Tomorrow morning, before Tommy wakes up. I won't call the police, but I can't have you here anymore. I can't put my son at risk for someone who's been lying to us from day one." Elizabeth nodded, accepting the verdict with the same composure she'd probably used in boardroom confrontations. But as James reached the front door, her voice stopped him. "For what it's worth," she said softly, "these 3 weeks with you and Tommy were the only real thing in my life. The only time I've felt like myself in years." James paused, his hand on the doorknob, wanting to turn around and comfort her despite everything. But Tommy's safety had to come first. His son had already lost one mother. James couldn't risk losing him to the chaos surrounding a fugitive from justice, no matter how much his heart wanted to believe in Anna's innocence. Morning came grey and drizzling, matching James's mood as he prepared breakfast for one small, confused boy. Tommy kept asking where Miss Anna was, why her bedroom door was closed when she'd be back to help with his spelling words. Each question felt like a knife twist in James's chest. How do you explain betrayal to an 8-year-old? How do you tell your son that the woman he'd come to love was never who she claimed to be? In the end, James settled for a simplified version of the truth. Miss Anna had to go away on business, and they weren't sure when she'd be back. Tommy accepted this with the resilience of childhood, but James could see the disappointment in his son's eyes. The house felt enormous without Anna's presence. Rooms that had seemed cozy and welcoming now echoed with emptiness. The kitchen still smelled faintly of vanilla from her pancakes. Tommy's homework sat half-finished on the dining room table, her neat handwriting visible in the margins where she'd helped him with difficult problems. Even the front porch felt wrong without her evening ritual of tea and quiet observation. James threw himself into work, taking on extra jobs that kept him away from home until Tommy was asleep. It was easier than facing the constant reminders of what they'd lost, or questioning whether he'd made the right choice in sending her away. A week passed. Then 2. James began to hope that maybe they could return to their old normal, the quiet life they'd led before Anna's arrival. Tommy gradually stopped asking about her, though James sometimes caught his son staring wistfully at the guest room door. The magazine article had sparked a media frenzy, with reporters calling the house at all hours asking if he'd seen Elizabeth Wynne. James lied smoothly, protecting her even as he tried to forget her. He told himself it was for Tommy's sake. But late at night, when sleep wouldn't come, he admitted the truth. He was protecting Anna because some part of him still believed in her innocence. The call came at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, exactly 4 weeks after Anna's departure. Tommy's frightened voice cut through James's sleep like a siren. "Daddy, I can't breathe right." James was beside his son's bed in seconds, feeling the boy's forehead and finding it burning with fever. Tommy's breathing was shallow and labored, his skin pale and clammy. Pneumonia, James realized with growing panic. His mother had died of the same condition when he was Tommy's age. Without hesitation, he scooped his son into his arms and raced for the truck. The emergency room at Millbrook General was a blur of bright lights and urgent voices. Tommy was whisked away on a gurney, leaving James alone in the waiting room with nothing but his fears and regrets. Sitting in that sterile hospital corridor, surrounded by the smell of disinfectant and the distant sounds of medical equipment, James felt more alone than he had since Sarah's death. Tommy was all he had left in the world. His purpose, his joy, his reason for getting up each morning. The thought of losing his son was unbearable, a pain so sharp it made him double over in his plastic chair. In his desperation, he found himself reaching for his phone, scrolling through contacts until he found the number Anna had programmed in weeks ago. His finger hovered over the call button. She was probably hundreds of miles away by now, living under a new identity, starting fresh somewhere that held no memories of their brief time together. But she answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting for his call. "James?" Her voice was thick with sleep, and something else. Hope, maybe, or fear. "Tommy's sick," he said without preamble, his voice breaking on his son's name. Pneumonia. He's in surgery now, and I don't know what to do." The silence on the other end stretched so long, James thought she might have hung up. Then he heard the sound of movement, footsteps, a door slamming. "I'm coming," Anna said, and the line went dead. James stared at his phone, wondering if he'd imagined the entire conversation. But 20 minutes later, the emergency room doors burst open, and Anna rushed in like an avenging angel. She'd hired a medical helicopter from Manhattan, bringing with her a team of pediatric specialists who descended on Tommy's case with the efficiency of a military operation. James watched in amazement as Elizabeth, transformed into someone he'd never seen before. Gone was the gentle woman who'd made pancakes and helped with homework. In her place stood a force of nature, directing medical personnel with the authority of someone accustomed to command. She'd changed clothes somewhere along the way, trading his old shirt and jeans for an expensive suit that marked her as someone whose word carried weight. Money flowed like water. Private rooms, the best equipment, consultations with doctors who normally had months-long waiting lists. As Tommy stabilized and was moved to a private room in the children's wing, Anna finally allowed herself to break down. James found her in the family lounge, her composed facade cracking as the adrenaline faded. "I was so scared," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "When you called, all I could think about was getting here in time. Nothing else mattered. Not the FBI, not Marcus, not the fact that showing up here probably destroyed any chance I had of staying hidden." She looked up at him with those familiar emerald eyes, and James saw not Elizabeth Wynne, the fugitive CEO, but Anna, the woman who'd loved his son like her own. "Why?" he asked simply. The question encompassed everything. Why she'd come, why she'd risked exposure, why she'd upended her life for a little boy she'd known for only 3 weeks. Anna's smile was sad and beautiful and utterly genuine. "Because I can't have children of my own," she said quietly. "I lost a baby once, years ago, and the complications... Well, let's just say motherhood was never going to be an option for me. My ex-husband couldn't handle that reality, and honestly, neither could I. I threw myself into work, built walls so high that no one could reach me. But Tommy, he reached me anyway. And you..." She touched his face gently, her fingers tracing the worry lines that had deepened over the past hours. "You both gave me something I thought I'd lost forever." The truth, when it finally came out, was more complex than either the magazine article or Anna's initial explanation had suggested. Marcus Webb had indeed orchestrated the fraud, but Elizabeth's hands weren't entirely clean. She'd suspected something was wrong for months, but had chosen to look the other way, prioritizing profits over ethics. When the investigation began, she'd tried to come forward with evidence of Marcus's manipulation, but he'd moved faster, painting her as the mastermind while positioning himself as a whistleblower. The truth lay somewhere in the middle. Elizabeth was neither the criminal mastermind portrayed in the media, nor the innocent victim she'd initially claimed to be. "I made mistakes," she admitted as they sat beside Tommy's hospital bed, watching their boy sleep peacefully for the first time in 48 hours. "I put money and success ahead of doing what was right. I ignored warning signs because confronting them would have meant admitting I'd been wrong about someone I trusted. I'm not the villain Marcus painted me as, but I'm not a saint either." James studied her face in the dim light of the hospital room, seeing the weight of guilt and regret she'd been carrying. It was a burden he understood. The knowledge that your choices, however well-intentioned, had led to pain for people you cared about. Over the following days, as Tommy recovered and grew stronger, Anna proved her commitment to their little family in ways that went far beyond the helicopter and private doctors. She moved into a hotel room across from the hospital, spending every waking hour at Tommy's bedside. She read him stories, played quiet games, and somehow convinced the hospital kitchen to produce a steady stream of his favorite foods. More importantly, she'd made arrangements with her lawyers to turn over all the evidence she'd gathered against Marcus, accepting that clearing her name would require facing the consequences of her own actions. The FBI arrived on Tommy's 4th day in the hospital. James watched through the room's window as Anna, she'd asked him to keep calling her that, saying Elizabeth felt like someone she used to be, spoke calmly with the federal agents. There were no handcuffs, no dramatic arrest scene, just a quiet conversation between professionals who understood that sometimes justice was more complicated than anyone wanted to admit. When they left, Anna returned to Tommy's room with a mixture of relief and resignation on her face. "It's over," she said simply. "The charges against Elizabeth Wynne will be dropped in exchange for my cooperation in prosecuting Marcus. But I'll have to testify, probably do some community service, and definitely stay out of the finance industry for the rest of my life." Tommy, who'd been listening with the uncanny perception of children, looked up from his coloring book with serious eyes. "Does this mean you have to go away again, Miss Anna?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Anna knelt beside his bed, taking his small hands in hers. "That depends," she said carefully, "on whether your daddy thinks you'd like to have me around permanently." Tommy's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Forever and ever?" he asked, bouncing slightly in his excitement. Anna looked at James over their son's head. When had he started thinking of Tommy as theirs? Seeking permission, asking forgiveness, offering hope. James thought about the past 6 weeks, the lies, the fear, the way his carefully ordered life had been turned upside down. Then he looked at Anna's face, remembering the woman who'd made pancakes in his kitchen, who'd bandaged scraped knees and helped with homework, who'd dropped everything to rush to Tommy's side when he needed her. Whatever else she might have done, whatever mistakes had brought her to his door, she loved his son with a fierceness that matched his own. And somewhere along the way, she'd taught him that his heart was big enough to love again without betraying Sarah's memory. 2 years later, on a warm May afternoon, James Miller stood in his backyard workshop, watching the most beautiful sight he'd ever seen. Anna, now legally Anna Miller, having taken his name if not his wedding ring, sat on the old porch swing he'd finally gotten around to fixing, her hands resting on the gentle curve of her 7-month belly. The doctors had called it a miracle. After years of believing she could never have children, Anna's body had somehow healed itself. "Love," she'd said when they got the news, "apparently fixes more than just broken hearts." Tommy, now 10 and the proud soon-to-be big brother, was teaching their golden retriever puppy to fetch in the grass nearby. The boy's laughter rang across the yard, pure and joyful, in the way that reminded James why he'd fallen in love with fatherhood in the first place. They'd never officially married. After everything they'd been through, legal documents seemed less important than the promises they'd made to each other in quieter moments. But their family was real in every way that mattered. Anna had used her financial expertise to help other women escape abusive situations, while James had expanded his electrical business to include Tommy as his enthusiastic, if occasionally distracted, assistant. The past wasn't forgotten. Sarah's photograph still held a place of honor in their living room, and Anna spoke of her predecessor with a respect that made James love her even more. They'd learned that families could grow and change without erasing what came before. Tommy understood that he'd been blessed with 2 mothers, one who'd given him life and one who'd chosen to love him as her own. The grief would always be there, but it had transformed from a sharp, cutting pain into something softer, a bittersweet reminder of love's power to endure beyond death. As the afternoon light began to fade, painting their small corner of Millbrook in golden hues, a car pulled up in front of their house. A young woman got out, carrying a crying infant, and looking around with the lost expression James recognized from his first glimpse of Anna in that basement 2 years ago. Anna noticed too, rising from the swing with the careful movements of pregnancy and walking toward their front gate. "Can I help you?" she called out, her voice carrying the same gentle warmth she'd once used to comfort Tommy's nightmares. James smiled, understanding that their story was far from over. They'd become a family not through conventional means, but through the messier, more complicated process of choosing each other despite their flaws and fears. Now they had a chance to extend that same grace to someone else who needed it. Tommy looked up from his puppy, seemed to assess the situation with the wisdom of a child who'd learned early about loss and recovery, and trotted over to join Anna at the gate. He was carrying his new flashlight, the one James had given him on his 10th birthday, to replace the old one that had brought them all together. Sometimes, James thought, watching his family welcome another lost soul into their orbit, the best things in life come from the most unexpected rescues. He tucked his tools away and headed toward the house, ready to set another place at their dinner table. After all, they had plenty of room for one more, and their little boy was about to learn that being a big brother meant more than just welcoming a new baby. It meant helping to build a family that could shelter anyone who needed it. The evening settled around them like a blessing, filled with the sounds of new beginnings and second chances. In the distance, church bells marked the hour, but James Miller was measuring time by different markers now. The sound of Tommy's laughter, the gentle curve of Anna's smile, and the endless possibility that tomorrow might bring another opportunity to save someone who desperately needed saving. Their house on Elm Street might not look like much from the outside, but inside it had become exactly what it was always meant to be. A home where broken things got fixed, lost people found their way, and love proved stronger than all the forces that tried to tear families apart.